What makes a country hated? Is it the power it wields over other nations? Is it its brutal policies that defy human rights? Or is the population itself responsible for global contempt? Get ready, because hatred for a nation can come from many sources, whether historical, political, cultural, or economic. Today, we're going to get to know the most hated countries in the world and find out what's really behind this universal contempt. And I'll give you a spoiler. One of the countries on this list will shock you with its unimaginable cruelties. Number 1. United States. It's impossible to start this list of hated countries without mentioning the United States. Despite calling itself the land of the free, the United States is, ironically, one of the most hated nations in the world, precisely because it does not respect the freedom of other nations. For many, the United States represents modern imperialism, using its military and economic power to intervene in the affairs of other countries, often with devastating consequences. The history of U.S. foreign interventions is long and includes the overthrow of several democracies, supported by the population. The U.S. military presence in various parts of the world, such as the Middle East, is seen as a form of domination and control, fueling resentment. In addition, unconditional support for Israel, the perception of arrogance in foreign policy, and the economic sanctions imposed on several countries contribute to this negative image. We can't forget the cultural impact of the United States, which is seen by many as a form of cultural colonialism, imposing its values and lifestyle on the rest of the world. Leaving North America, we cross the Atlantic to reach the heart of Eastern Europe, where we will find another power that arouses strong feelings around the world. Number 2. Russia. Russia, a giant that was once the main adversary of the United States during the Cold War, continues to generate distrust and hatred in many parts of the world. With a history marked by authoritarianism and interventions in neighboring countries, Russia is seen by many as a threat to global peace. The annexation of Crimea in 2014 was a turning point, generating international sanctions and global condemnation. In addition, support for authoritarian regimes such as Bashar al-Assad's in Syria and suspicions of interference in foreign elections feed Russia's image as a nation that defies international norms in search of power and influence. And of course, the war in Ukraine has further intensified hatred towards the country, with millions of refugees and a conflict that seems to have no end. But we can't leave out of this list human rights violations, including its treatment of LGBT citizens. The country classified homosexuality as a crime until 1993 and as a mental illness until 1999. More recently, it passed a law banning gay propaganda and hate crimes against lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender citizens have increased. Now we leave the cold of Russia and head to the east, where an ancient nation divides opinion. Number 3. China. China, with its rich history and ancient culture, is today seen as a rising superpower, but not without controversy. The country's impressive economic growth in recent decades has been accompanied by a series of issues that generate mistrust and, in many cases, hatred. The treatment of ethnic minorities, especially the Uyghurs, a Muslim group living in the Xinjiang region, is one of the main points of criticism. The Uyghurs have faced severe restrictions and human rights abuses, such as detention in re-education camps and intensive surveillance. In addition, restrictions on freedoms in Hong Kong and widespread censorship within the country are cause for great concern. The country's assertive stance in the South China Sea and growing tensions with Taiwan mean that many see it as a threat to regional stability. Within China, many want more freedom, but the Chinese Communist Party maintains an authoritarian stance. This results in a perspective considered terrible by several human rights organizations, which highlight violations of fundamental rights, including the freedoms of expression, assembly, association, and religion. Accusations of espionage and the trade war with the United States also fuel the rivalry between the world's two largest economies. Still in Asia, we move on to the Middle East, a region marked by conflict and controversy, starting with one of the region's most influential and polarizing nations. Number 4. Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, known for its vast oil reserves and authoritarian regime, is often in the news, and rarely for the right reasons. Ruled by an absolute monarchy with a strict interpretation of Islamic law, the country is known for its severe restrictions on human rights, especially in relation to women. The death penalty is often applied for serious crimes and even for minor infractions, such as adultery and rejection of religion. Reports of torture and violence by police and security forces are common. The situation for the LGBT community is even bleaker. Homosexuality is punishable by death, and the rights of LGBT people are practically non-existent. Women also face severe restrictions. They need the permission of a male guardian to marry, divorce, travel, or get a job. They cannot eat in restaurants without a specific family section and must use separate entrances from men. In addition, Saudi Arabia is accused of supporting and financing various terrorist groups, which increases international distrust. The country is also one of the most militarized in the world and has been criticized for war crimes in its intervention in Yemen, which reinforces its negative reputation globally. We leave Saudi Arabia to explore another nation on the Asian continent that is also known for its cruelty and controversies: North Korea. Number 5. North Korea. North Korea is known for being one of the most closed and controlled countries in the world, often called a pariah state, for its isolationist and repressive stance. Since its inception, the country has been ruled by a family dynasty, currently led by Kim Jong-un, who exercises strict control over every aspect of his citizens' lives. The North Korean government brutally represses any form of opposition. Anyone who dares to challenge the regime can end up in prison camps, where conditions are inhumane. The freedoms we consider basic, such as freedom of expression and movement, simply don't exist there. Censorship is total. The media is controlled by the state, and the population only has access to a government-controlled intranet with no contact with the global internet. Any attempt to communicate with the outside world is blocked, keeping citizens in a bubble of disinformation. Daily life in North Korea is extremely difficult. The government decides people's professions, distributes food, which is scarce, and forbids leaving the country without permission, which is almost impossible to obtain. Women, in particular, face aggression and have few rights. Despite the poverty and scarcity of resources, the government invests large sums in military development, including a controversial nuclear program, increasing tensions with the rest of the world. Now, let's move on to a country whose complex history places it at the center of numerous current global controversies. Number 6. Israel. Israel is a polarizing nation on the global stage. On the one hand, the country is seen as a democratic stronghold in the Middle East. On the other, it faces heavy criticism for its actions towards the Palestinians. The expansion of Israeli settlements on Palestinian land and the construction of barriers dividing communities generate intense resentment. Frequent conflicts in the Gaza Strip and control over the Palestinian population increase tension in the region. In addition, the United States' firm support for Israel reinforces the idea that the country acts with little concern for international consequences. Leaving this conflictive region, we will now explore South Asia, passing through 3 neighboring countries, often associated with terrorism and instability. Number 7. Pakistan. This country has a tumultuous history, marked by tensions with India and a series of internal conflicts. Pakistan is often seen as a haven for extremist and terrorist groups, compounded by deep corruption and serious human rights violations. Religious minorities and women face discrimination and oppression. Law enforcement is often questionable, with people being sentenced to death in secret and unfair trials. In addition, freedom of expression is severely limited, with repressions against those who criticize the government. Pakistan's links with groups like the Taliban further intensify the negative perception. And speaking of the Taliban, that brings us to the country controlled by the group. Number 8. Afghanistan. Since the Taliban regained power in 2021, the country has been plunged into an even deeper crisis. Under the fundamentalist regime, Afghan women face a horrible situation. They are isolated and brutalized. The Taliban has imposed severe restrictions on women's lives, which include the obligation to completely cover their bodies and faces, and strict prohibitions on the female voice in public, and the mixing of men and women. In addition, any deviation from the imposed norms can result in severe punishments, from warnings and fines to imprisonment and physical violence. The Taliban's promises to ease these restrictions often turn out to be false, further exacerbating the desperate situation of women in the country. And to complete one of the most conflictive regions in the world, we have to talk about our Persian neighbor. Number 9. Iran. With a theocratic regime, Iran is known for adopting Sharia law, which profoundly affects the lives of women and minorities. Internally, the country faces severe criticism for repressing civil liberties and punishing many crimes with death. Although Iran has a fascinating history as home to one of the world's oldest civilizations, its instability makes it one of the most hated countries. International concerns include the repression of civil and political rights and the strict application of the death penalty. Iran's nuclear program has also generated serious global concerns. The country is seen as an actor that undermines U.S. allies by supporting militant groups and funding violent militias in the Middle East. Iran's actions, such as ballistic missile tests and support for terrorist groups, increase tension and mistrust on the international stage. Number 10. Iraq. No one will be surprised to see Iraq among the most hated countries in the world, especially given its status as a very high-profile war zone. The prolonged conflict between the Islamic State and government forces has devastated the country. Islamic State, an extremist group that emerged as an offshoot of Al-Qaeda, sought to establish an Islamic caliphate in the region. They used brutal tactics such as suicide attacks, indiscriminate shooting in civilian areas, and planting landmines. In addition, the group has used civilians as human shields and carried out a series of violent attacks that have intensified the humanitarian crisis. But it's not just the extremist group that is perpetuating the chaos. The Iraqi government forces also have a bad reputation. They have been responsible for destroying civilian homes, looting property, and committing serious abuses such as enforced disappearances, torture, and executions. There are even reports of children being forced to become soldiers. These abuses and the ongoing instability help solidify Iraq's position among the most hated countries in the world. Number 11. United Kingdom and France. The United Kingdom and France are two countries that often appear on lists of globally disliked nations, and with good reason. The UK, with its imperialist past, controlled many territories around the globe and exploited their resources and people. This legacy still affects how the country is perceived today. Recently, the UK's participation in conflicts such as the Iraq War and the decision to leave the European Union in 2016, known as Brexit, have also increased criticism. Leaving the European Union in particular was seen as an act of isolation that complicated the UK's relations with other countries. France, for its part, has also benefited greatly from colonization. The country controlled large areas in Africa and Southeast Asia, which left wounds that are still open. Let's not forget that France bears historical responsibility for the Haitian crisis. And if you want to know more about it, there's a video on the channel that talks about this responsibility and the devastation caused to this country that is only suffering. In addition, France is criticized for banning religious symbols, such as the Islamic headscarf, in public schools, which many see as a violation of religious freedom. France also carries out military interventions in countries such as Mali and in the Middle East, which is seen as an attempt to maintain its global influence. And to make matters worse, the French are often seen as rude and pretentious, which can further affect the negative perception of the country. So both the UK and France have a history of exploitation and policies that still impact the way they are perceived in the world. Number 12. Germany. Still in Europe, our next destination is Germany, famous for its Oktoberfest. Although Germany is now an economic and political powerhouse in Europe, the country still carries the weight of a recent past. The Second World War and the Holocaust left deep scars, and the country is still dealing with the consequences. Even with efforts to reconcile and repair relations, the weight of the Nazi past is still a concern, and recently, the resurgence of political groups promoting these same extreme and racist ideologies has fueled the negative perception. In addition, Germany plays a dominant role in the European Union, which can generate discontent among other European countries. An example of this was the Greek debt crisis. During the economic crisis in Greece, Germany, as one of Europe's largest economies, took a strict stance on the reforms that Greece had to implement in order to receive financial aid. Many felt that this stance was excessive and insensitive to the difficulties faced by the Greeks, which led to tensions between the two countries. Number 13. Japan. Now let's return to the Asian continent to visit a country that is loved by many, mainly for its culture, but which is also hated by many due to historical events. Japan, famous for its advanced technology and pop culture, carries an imperialist past that still generates resentment in many parts of Asia. During the Second World War, this nation was responsible for significant atrocities. One of the most notorious events was the Nanjing Massacre, where mass murder and brutal violence took place against civilians and prisoners of war. In Korea, the Japanese occupation also left deep scars. Many Korean women were forced to work in military brothels, suffering severe abuse during this period. Despite having become a peaceful and prosperous nation, the wounds of the past are still remembered. And so we conclude our journey through the world's most hated countries in our Bello Mundo. Each of these nations carries with it a unique combination of history, politics, and culture that, in the eyes of many, make them worthy of contempt. What do you think of this list? Do you agree with it? Would you include any countries? Tell us which one made your jaw drop. Leave your opinion in the comments and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Share the video with your friends so that they too can discover these and other incredible curiosities. Thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you on our next trip.